Goma and konnichiwa. Plus, you have a sale. Will here to the POLIT'AI CHI. Doing the brief intro so you know the video highlight. You know what you're in for, video highlights wise. Coming up, throwing in my 2 cents as well. Hopefully it's worth a quarter to you. Now this ain't some trendy hashtag, but I'm on top of all this, like some of my colleagues there at Fox News, and I can say that it's a pseudo. I've been doing this news playlist for a while, POLIT'AI CHI, and we're talking about this fool, and it just proves my theory. When you dorks get into power, it's a dangerous thing. Now, I'm not calling President Xi a dork, but you can't trust that smirk. The man's never truly smiled on camera. I mean, it's gotten to the point now where it's starting to look more and more like the best thing that came out of China in some time is the Tao Te Ching. And I talk about it all the time. There is Lao Tzu. Actual representation. The origin of yin and yang, the Tai Chi symbol, that's the logo. What's going on is, it's a little bit more overt with Russia. You know, locking arms with Venezuela, being a self-avowed, they themselves, self-avowed, we could say that, socialist country. And so Russia, you know, flies in a couple, gee, they kind of look oddly enough like B-1 bombers with nuclear capabilities. This is sort of pseudo-Cuba missile crisis right there in Venezuela. You know, doing training over the Caribbean. What's next? They're going to do flyovers over the figures coming up. And interestingly enough, the date stamps, pay attention to those. Calling you, President Obama, you keep talking about your precious affordable health, you know, the Affordable Care Act. Let's just call it that, not Obamacare. It's sort of a slight on the man. You know, he had good intentions. It just didn't work out in this country. You can't try to make a socialist program work in a free market capitalistic economy or country with such a system in place. So we have a bunch of that going on. But with regard to this, that was his focus. And in executive orders, I blame Mitch McConnell. You know, the first thing out of the man's mouth, again, as already previously stated. As previously stated. You know, I give the man credit for trying to do the right thing, but he didn't have a whole hell of a lot of help from Congress. You know, first thing out of Mitch McConnell's mouth is like, we're going to block everything this president tries to do. Where was that coming from and why? And he's still the Senate, you know, majority leader. I don't think much of Mitch McConnell. You have to go back to Bill Frist. But then he was ousted because he was of a centrist. Again, we centrists, we try to do the right, you know, be inclusive without being PC. And, you know, those political types, whoop, get outed. Even Trent Lott seems better than Mitch McConnell. So all of these date stamps, given, you know, their timeline during President Obama's presidency, super aggravating. And now we're in this kind of situation. All right. Thanks for watching. No silly DUIs while you're out there. Roll.
China and Russia moving rapidly to insinuate and quickly broaden their influence in this hemisphere, as our national security leaders seem publicly to lament their encroachment and expansionary foreign policies elsewhere in the world, whether the Middle East or Africa, while China and Russia challenge U.S. influence here in this hemisphere. In Venezuela, Russian nuclear-capable bombers capable of carrying nuclear missiles carried out a 10-hour training exercise with the Venezuelan Air Force over the Caribbean Sea. The exercise comes as the Chinese investments in Central America, winning contracts, for example, in Panama and in Ecuador, among other nations, building ports, convention centers, bridges over the Panama Canal, China taking effective control of that canal, establishing debt traps across the region for economically struggling small Central and South American nations. Why are our intelligence agencies, the State Department, the Defense Department, the President's National Security Council, seemingly ignoring all of these developments, at least publicly? There's nothing new about China's rising belligerence and direct threat to U.S. interests. The Department of Justice just issued a report finding more than 90% of federal economic espionage cases are linked to one nation, and that is China. And over 2/3 of the DOJ's theft of trade secrets in this report linked to, again, China. So how is the Pentagon defending against the Chinese and the Russian flexing of muscle in this hemisphere? Certainly not by military deployment. Just to put this in some context, we have about 200,000 troops deployed around the globe, fewer than 2,000 of them in Central and South America. Joining me now, Gordon Chang, columnist, attorney, author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China, the book, The Nuclear Showdown. Gordon spent almost 2 decades working in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Great to have you with us. Gordon, now let's start with first the Africa Prosperity, this initiative enunciated by John Bolton, the President's National Security Advisor. It seems it couldn't have been more poorly timed or more poorly placed than Africa, for crying out loud.
Yeah, it's poorly executed as well because it's unresourced. You know, Bolton has said to African nations, look, you got to choose between China and Russia on one side or the United States on the other. Well, with China dumping so much money in there, that's an easy question for those countries. We're going to lose that one. If we're going to challenge the Chinese and Russians in Africa, let's at least do it in a way that we can prevail. But as you point out, look, we've got other priorities right now, and that's certainly much closer to home because you have the Russians cooperating with the Venezuelans. You have the Chinese putting Venezuela into a debt trap, and so clearly you have both Moscow and Beijing challenging us just miles from our borders.
And without apparent response. This is a curious, if you will, bifurcation of interest, U.S. interest, to suddenly focus on Africa, where the Chinese have, for the past at least decade and a half, been investing, buying and controlling commodities, and whether it be rare earth, whether it be metals, whatever it may be. They have such an advance in the region of the African continent that it's unimaginable that there would not be a strategy and, as you say, resources articulated by the administration if they're going to come up with some sort of African initiative.
You know, the most important thing right now in terms of our security is what's happening on our southern border, because you have all of these people leaving their countries, and the reason why is because those countries are doing very poorly. And this is going to be a continuing problem. But you know, the United States, administration in and administration out, have really just neglected Latin America. You can think back only until Grenada in the Reagan administration, when it was at the top of our foreign policy priorities.
And Panama, which we invaded, of course, and it took, anyway, to look back on it is unhelpful, I suppose, at this point, because we have watched president after president ignore what is an appropriate strategic response, it would seem, at least to me, rather than investing trillions of dollars. And now, by the way, the clever U.S. multinationals are understanding it's time to move out of China because that promise is not going to be fulfilled.
You know, November 2013, John Kerry, Secretary of State, says, look, we're abandoning the Monroe Doctrine. You know, the Monroe Doctrine is...
It was a great November when he did that.
You know, this is the doctrine that the United States says we're opposing colonialism in our region. Now, why would we want free and independent countries in our regions to be colonies of foreign powers? I just don't get it.
We're beyond now colonization. We're talking now about 2 world powers that are now in this hemisphere, and they're saying it's pretty clear. There has not been so much as a riposte in the most subtle, nuanced, even vague way on the part of the United States to their initiative to assert their influence and direct opposition to the United States in this hemisphere. What are we to do?
Yeah, well, I think that what we first of all got to do is have some leadership on the part of the White House to make sure that multinationals understand the importance of investing in our own region. I think President Trump has done something like that by trying to get the supply chains out of China. If we can get them out of China, we can get them into our region. We can then tie their economies more closely to ours. Then I think a number of these problems go away.
Even by by any narcissistic standard. The most divisive president in modern American history went on then to say, many people now doubt the very notion of common ground in our political discourse. I'm sure you know a couple, but he's always, well, so hopeful. New Fox poll numbers show strong Republican support for President Trump. Are you ready? 88% of Republican voters approve of the job President Trump is doing in Washington. Joining me now, former Reagan White House political director, Fox Business political analyst Ed Rollins, and the dean of political strategists in this country. Great to have you with us. What do you think of the idea? I'm tempted to ask you about Obama, but let's not.
He was hopeful that his successor was going to be Mrs. Clinton, too. That didn't work out quite so well.
Yeah, but he's going to stick with hope.
Right.
I don't think he could have overworked that word a bit. Let's turn to this, the very idea that we're going to ignore what the Chinese and the Russians are doing in this hemisphere, and we're going to suddenly, as Ambassador Bolton, the National Security Advisor, said today, we're going to talk about Africa prosper. It's some sort of initiative that I can't frankly fathom at all when you've got extant and proximate threats to the national interest.
Well, the bottom line is we're never going to compete with China in Africa, and we need to compete with everybody here in this hemisphere and do everything we can to make this hemisphere stronger with our investments and with our military and what have you, and we have to protect ourselves. President Reagan did that, President Kennedy did that.
So how does an administration end up with neither a defense secretary, a State Department state secretary, a national security advisor focused on what is happening at the border? The president is talking about it every day. He's focusing on the southern border and the threats, whether it's drugs, whether it's terrorists, whether it's the Chinese coming up for a visit from the Panama Canal, or the Russians and the Iranians in Venezuela, or, you know, I mean, it goes on and on.
Our neighbors are very susceptible, and the threat is very high. So I think from our perspective, if we don't focus on it now, we're going to be focused on it big time in a very short period of time.